Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, and I hope you're going to get that incredible quintessential drink, because so many of you drink the most unusual concoctions, and whatever it is, go and get it, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was an exquisitely beautiful, idyllic, welcoming and sunny day in early spring. The long drawn-out, bitterly cold Arctic winter was finally behind us, and my husband Roy and I lay on the picnic rug, soaking up the sunshine like hungry lizards coming out of a convoluted, prolonged hibernation. The flowery meadow was vibrant with colourful, showy spring flowers, from purples to pinks, lilacs, blues and yellows, some with petals shaped like dangling bells, and others were tightly clustered together like roses. The prairie was set against the statuesque mountain views of Washington State, along with clusters of Douglas firs, their pine needles enveloping the air in a fresh woody scent. Neither of us said a single word. The silence was sweet, golden, and somewhat pleasantly intoxicating. And somehow, saying anything at all spoilt the magic of this illustrious moment. We both watched the two horses in the opposite field, basking in the radiance of the sunshine, and shaking their long dark manes. And we were both bedazzled and beguiled by the beauty of this tranquil day, that is still crisply marked in the memory, as if it were yesterday for me. I raised myself off the ground, reluctantly wiping the grass off my jeans, and glancing briefly at my watch. We better be getting back, I sighed. Great Aunt May will be expecting us back for tea. We held hands together, filled with the joy of our fresh new love, which was in the spring of its awakening. We walked through the undulating emerald green grass towards the charming farmhouse. This imposing house really rather reminded me of an old, quaint English cottage, only it was much larger and grander in size and scale, with whitewashed brick walls, ample-sized bay windows, and sizable Wedgwood blue shutters that overlooked ravishing, awe-inspiring views of the countryside, accentuated by a stylish pale blue front door, surrounded by pretty climbing yellow roses. We walked through the stylish open courtyard that was framed by an arched trellis of climbing red roses, and on either side of the elegant arch was a terraced, very manicured front yard, with chessboard-like squares that alternated between squares of grass and of terracotta, all perfectly fringed by miniature hedges and beds of lavender and red roses. Before long we were in the living-room area, having what our eccentric aunt always referred to as high tea, born from her distinguished English lineage on her mother's side of the family. Aunt May was famous for her teas in the local town, and always served delicate cucumber or salmon sandwiches made from the thinnest delicate triangles of bread, boiled eggs with squares of toasts, scones with jam and clotted cream, chocolate cake, and apple and custard Danish pastries. Aunt May was a very elegant, stylish elderly lady in her early 80s, who wore tweed skirts, cashmere sweaters and pearls, and her white hair was always swept back in a tight, neat bun. I watched her shaking as she poured us piping hot cups of English breakfast tea into royal Doulton china cups, and she always joked that she made builder's tea, because in England the builders always drank their tea extra strong, which was just how Aunt May liked it. She absolutely loathed modern mugs, as she claimed tea drunk from a delicate porcelain china cup was infinitely more pleasurable, and over time, when I began to drink tea this way, I believed she was absolutely right. "You are probably wondering why I invited you both over to stay the weekend here with me," she said, looking at us through her piercing Arctic blue eyes. "No, not really, Aunt May," I said. "It's always lovely to see you, especially staying with you in the country like this. It's so beautiful out here. It's so much nicer than being stuck in Seattle." "Well, I'm glad to hear it," said Aunt May. "I have a proposition for the both of you," she said. "You can see I'm not getting any younger these days, and managing this farm of mine has become increasingly difficult and more like a burden than a pleasure. Unfortunately, my advancing years is beginning to take its toll on my body, which is not what it used to be. Sadly, the progression of age is not for the faint-hearted, I can assure you. I know the two of you lovebirds recently got married, and I wondered if you fancied laying the foundation of your nest here by managing this farm for me, and I'll pay you for your trouble, of course. I do have one condition, and that is I want to live here with the both of you in the downstairs bedroom until I finally pop my clogs. After that, this whole place will be yours. I couldn't bear the idea of spending my last days in a nursing home. I won't ask you to care for a frail old lady, because if I need a nurse, I'll almost certainly get one, as I have no intention of becoming a burden to anyone, least of all you. But I don't want to leave this place, as it's always been my home, and this is where I would like to breathe my very last. What do you say?" My husband and I looked at each other in complete astonishment. "You're leaving this place to us?" I asked, "in your will?" "Yes, that is my intention," said Aunt May. "I want to leave my home to someone who will truly appreciate it and value it as much as I have done over the years. Evangeline, I've had you in my mind for inheriting my home since you were 16 years old." "Why me?" I asked. "Well, you are very different to your two younger sisters. You've always been so comfortable out here on the farm. And growing up as a young girl, you loved it. I think this lifestyle would fit you perfectly like a glove. And this house needs an owner that truly appreciates her. I've always believed that houses choose their owners." And so it was my husband and I moved in with Aunt May. It was a no-brainer for us, as we'd always fancied living in the countryside, and I didn't know a more magnificent country abode than Aunt May's beautiful home, so inheriting her exquisite farmhouse was more than I could have ever envisaged or forecast for my life. It was like all my Christmases had come at once. My husband's job working as a writer for a corporate company meant he could work from home, and so things could not have been more perfect as far as we were both concerned, and living with my great-aunt May during the last decade of her life I saw as a complete privilege rather than an inconvenience. If she had been a tumultuous, disagreeable, cantankerous sort of character, that would have been a completely different matter, of course, but Aunt May was as sweet as you could get. "I have something very significant to show you," said Aunt May, "and now that you've moved in, you need to know about it." She led us down to her cellar and pulled away a table and chairs, removing the rug off the floor, and we discerned a well-hidden trapdoor that appeared to be locked. I was utterly astonished. "What's this?" I asked my aunt, looking at her with a perplexed expression on my face. "It's not where you've stashed away all your nuggets of gold bullion, is it?" I teased. Aunt May's blue eyes twinkled with humour. "I wish," she giggled. "I wouldn't be adverse to having a treasure trove down here, but alas, that's not what this is." "More's the shame," I joked. "What is this then, Aunt May?" I asked. "Your great-uncle's father built this in 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, after which the United States declared war on Japan. That was when Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. I gather it was referred to as Hitler's most puzzling decision of World War II. As you know, we were officially considered neutral during the war at the time. Your great-uncle's father hated, despised, and loathed Hitler with a fervent passion. He did not trust that evil, duplicitous man as far as you could throw him. He would say, 'Look at that obnoxious, deplorable man. He's trying to mind control the masses. Like innocent lambs, he is leading them to the slaughter. Why are the people so bedazzled by his words, as though they're under some kind of hypnotic hold? It breaks my heart to see this going on in our lifetime. Who knows if our children's children will have any hope for their futures?'" He was, of course, not wrong about that. So convinced he was that the Germans might ultimately invade America that he decided to build this underground tunnel that leads directly from the house to the woods. He wanted the family to have means of escape if German soldiers came knocking at our door, and of course a safe place to hide if indeed we were being bombed, which of course was highly unlikely to happen, given how sprawling and widespread America actually is, as bombers would be more likely to attack a very built-up area like New York, much like the air raids and bombings on London. "How big is it?" I asked. "The tunnel, I mean." "It's big enough, but I have not been in there for years," said Aunt May. "Why not?" I asked my aunt. "You could have turned it into an extra storage area or something." "It's haunted," said my aunt, looking at me with wide, earnest eyes, "which is why you must keep it locked at all times and leave well alone." "How do you know it's haunted?" I asked. "Your great-uncle decided to explore the tunnel one day, long after the house became into our possession, after his father had died. I remember it had been snowing heavily that day, with very severe blizzards and freezing conditions, so we stayed inside by a crackling fire and played cards and all kinds of board games to keep ourselves busy. My husband was a very hyped-up individual, so keeping him contained was pretty much like keeping a Jack Russell in a shoebox for days on end. It was like he had ants in his pants. He was so frustrated about being snowed in by the brutally unkind weather conditions. That was when he thought about exploring the tunnel underground and ventured in there with his torch and, of course, layers of warm clothing, and off he went. I never wanted to accompany him. It looked awfully sinister inside. I remember when he came back, he was as white as a sheet, and all the colour had drained from his face, and he was shaking like a leaf. I asked him what on earth was wrong, but he stared at me very blankly, and was so withdrawn and subdued that he didn't say a word for 2 whole days. It really was very disturbing. "What? He never spoke to you for 2 whole days?" I asked. "That's extraordinary. He must have been really spooked by something." That's exactly what I concluded. I knew something quite dreadful must have happened to him. But what? I couldn't fathom. Finally, when he did actually speak, he told me that this underground passage was a portal to the underbelly of hell itself. "What?" "Sorry, I don't mean to be rude, Aunt May. I'm only laughing, for the very notion of what you suggest is utterly ridiculous." "Well, I believe, Ted," said Aunt May. "Laugh as much as you like, Evangeline, but your great-uncle did not scare easily. So if you had seen him that day, you wouldn't have doubted his word either. I knew he'd seen something quite terrible underground. Quite terrible," she repeated. "Well, what exactly did he claim to have seen, Aunt May?" I asked. "Your uncle describes walking down a very long, dark, gloomy, cheerless tunnel, and being violently hit or assaulted by a nasal explosion of sulphurous compounds that smelt of rotting, decaying flesh, that made his eyes burn and his body become nauseous and sick, as so repugnant, vile, and sickly sweet and odorous was that stench. Without question, the smell was of death itself. It was when he turned left down the dusty passage, strewn with silken cobwebs and colossal-looking spiders, that he saw several large rats bolting past him warily in the darkness. At this point, his heart rate had increased in intensity, and he could feel its thunderous vibration pounding through his chest, and he described feeling exceedingly claustrophobic. He knew in his heart he shouldn't be there, but he needed to see what lay beyond the passage, and that was when your uncle ascertained that he had entered into an ambiguous realm or underworld, if you like, that was like a tributary to hell itself, that belonged to the souls of the damned. It was in a moment of horrified revulsion, through the intense, bleak darkness, he beheld the tall, dark, shadowy silhouettes of giant demonical creatures stoking up the flames of a crackling, thriving fire, using timber sticks to increase its intensity of heat, which he described as unbearable, stuffy, and overwhelming. Worse still, he saw animal skeletons lying scattered all over the ground. Everything was blacker than the inkiest black, and the darkness was smoky, smouldery, and thick. All of a sudden, he could perceive these demonical, hulky, shadowy forms, again in greater visual authenticity, and described them seemingly darker than the darkness itself, with burly, fuzzy shapes and bright, dazzling red eyes, that was so menacing that he said his blood turned as cold as ice. He described with great trepidation and angst a towering 10-foot giant turning around to look directly at him, and upon seeing him the entity curled back its lips and unleashed the most blood-curdling scream, and your great-uncle ran down the tunnel as fast as he possibly could, with his adrenaline surging through his blood at an alarming pace, while the demoniacal being was in hot pursuit of him, and was clearly desirous to seize him and drag him into the inferno reserved for the wicked. He could hear its dragon-like deep guttural breaths. Your great-uncle was completely terrified, and when he reached the door in the cellar, he promptly locked it behind him, and he could hear the beast tapping at the door. And this happened for many long days. Your great-uncle would walk in those woods sometimes at night, and there were occasions he would swear blindly that even those woods became connected sometimes to the perilous unspeakable portal in the abyss in some way, for he had seen shadowy dark figures moving between the trees and watching him. He had felt their eyes on him, and heard their disembodied screams that sounded like a woman being murdered. He even told me once that he had seen smoke rising from the ground in the woods and dissipating in a strange spiral that was not of this world. Your description sounds awful, Aunt May, I said, but I find it exceedingly difficult to believe that there actually is a portal to hell in this home. I just don't see it somehow. That sort of thing doesn't happen. I mean, I hate to put a spanner in the works, but that idea is nonsensical to me. Consider C.S. Lewis's story, The Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe. There was a portal that led to another world, Narnia, I think it was called, which the children found. Yes, Aunt May, but that's a kid's story, I said. It was imaginary. It wasn't true. I don't believe a kid's story is just rooted in a foundation of lies. There has to be truth behind it. I do believe there are portals between worlds. Even psychics tell you of such things and refer to it as a veil. Well, I don't deny that there may be portals, Aunt May. I'm not disputing that, but I think that what Evangeline is trying to say, my husband interceded, is that maybe there's a rational explanation for what happened to your husband, Ted. And maybe his experience was not paranormal at all. You mean like he was drinking or taking drugs, so he was hallucinating this place of purgatory, piped May. Absolutely not. Ted wasn't even partial to drinking. There are hundreds of things you need to rule out first, before you lay claim to something like the paranormal or outer-worldly. Practical considerations, like your husband's eyesight at the time, or the quality of the torch he was using. How dark was it underground? What about the imagination's incredible ability and extraordinary propensity to blow everything out of proportion, especially in situations driven and compounded by the weight of fear, where we may have an exaggerated impression of things? What do you mean? Asked May. Well, let me give you an example, said Roy. When I was a little boy, I was taken to the sick bay at our school. I was very ill. I began to vomit all over the place. I told the matron that I felt like I was dying because I felt that bad. On my part, it was a magnified or aggrandized expression for how I was feeling. But the horrified, alarmed matron took me at my word quite literally, and promptly informed my parents to come to the sick bay at the school at once, because their boy was dying. My mother was very frantic and said, "Oh, my goodness, what's wrong?" And the matron said that I was seriously ill and had expressed strong feelings that I did not think I was going to make it.
My mother and father promptly dropped everything to race to the school through heavy traffic, and my poor father nearly had a heart attack on the way. My mother was still wearing her hair in curlers and a dressing gown, and was in bare feet when they arrived at the sick bay. I looked at them and smiled and said, "Are we going home now? My tummy still feels a bit sore." My mother looked at me and scolded me. "How dare you scare my life like this, son? I thought you were dying." And she promptly burst into tears, crying tears of joy and relief. It turned out that the matron had taken me at my word quite literally, thought I was dying based on what I'd told her.
Quite honestly, I have never heard anything so utterly ridiculous in all my born days, said my Aunt May. What a very silly woman. The school should have fired her on the spot for scaring your parents half to death like that. If she thought you were dying, why on earth didn't she call the ambulance? I mean, really, the mind boggles the common sense that some people tend to lack these days. As you can imagine, there was absolutely no point in arguing with Aunt May, who was utterly and totally convinced that in some way there was a passage or portal to hell under her home. But Roy and I were far from persuaded by this preposterous, almost ludicrous allegation. We were very grounded, cynical people that had about as much imagination as a ferret, which pretty much means we had virtually none at all. So one weekend when my aunt went to stay with an old friend for the weekend, we decided to explore the tunnel that my great-uncle's father had built all those years ago. Roy broke open the combination lock with a pickaxe, and we stealthily climbed cautiously down the stairs. It was easy to see why Ted may have felt intimidated, overawed, and exceedingly daunted by this tunnel, as it was incredibly dark and discomposing, and we could barely see our hands before our faces. But even with the dim light of our torch, and coupled by good coordination and nimble feet, we made our way circumspectly down the tunnel, which smelt damp and musty. We walked past silken fibres of fibrous webs, which brushed against our faces like the invisible hands of ghosts. If we had engaged our imaginations or paranoia in full gear, we may have believed the spooky dungeon to be haunted, but Roy and I remained judicious and prudent, refusing to jump to all kinds of conclusions, however disquieting and ghoulish the tunnel might have appeared. To be honest, I would not have been comfortable hiding in this inauspicious location during the wartime. I think I'd rather have taken my chances running above the ground from the Germans. I really don't like it down here. It's so creepy, I told my husband. I don't understand why my uncle's father would build such a foreboding, sinister place. Couldn't he have at least made it a little bit more pleasant and lighter? "You must remember, he lived during a very tumultuous time," said Roy. "It was a daunting, frightening time for people. There was a distinct possibility that America could be dragged into the World War, especially after the Pearl Harbor attack. So I think your uncle's father wanted to ensure your family was very safe. I would describe him as what is known today as a prepper." Even so, I don't like it here. Before long, the passage changed and branched out into a sizable room that was luxuriously covered in deer pelts, that made the floor appear like a thick, luxuriant carpet that had been superbly preserved, and smelt of pine cones mixed with body sweat. In the middle of the room was a fire pit, where large stones had been meticulously arranged in a wide circle, and there were ashes in the circle from an old fire. We could see an area of ventilation, where the smoke could leave the room through a hole in the ceiling, which to an outsider might appear as though the ground was indeed smoking. There was a weaved basket that was full of hazelnuts, walnuts and chestnuts, which are seasonally fruitful trees on our land, and another basket full of edible mushrooms, roots and tubers, along with a hollow stone containing a wax cone of natural honey. On one of the walls there was an arrangement of eagle's feathers that had been stuck to the wall with a sticky tree resin. It looked like it held some kind of symbolic meaning. There were large tree trunk stumps that were dotted around the room like makeshift chairs, and an area in the room where a neat selection of stones were piled together. As we moved to the end of the room, we came to a concrete step that opened up to a trapdoor in the ground that was almost identical to the one in the cellar, only much thicker and more robust,
possibly designed to withstand the outside elements, or the wear and tear caused from the erosion of wind, hail, rain, sleet or snow. We pushed it open, and it met with some resistance, so we thrust it forcefully harder, and the door bounced open, and we magically found ourselves climbing out of the ground into the heart of the woods. We realised something or someone had covered the door with moss to render it invisible and inconspicuous, so that even a discerning eye would be very unlikely to perceive it, should they happen to be walking in the forest. It was clear several beings were using this underground shelter as a home. All of a sudden we could hear what I can only describe as someone very large ambling towards us, because rustling, crunching noises from heavy footfall was so incredibly substantial that whoever this was appeared weighty, ungainly, cumbersome, and excessively bulky in size. We quickly closed the door, covered it with moss, and promptly went and hid behind a large tree, waiting with bated breath to see who or what was coming. Then we saw him, and nothing prepared me for what I was beholding. Even in my wildest, most outlandish imaginings, I could never have envisaged a creature like this existing in our reality, for it was monstrously huge in size, weight and girth, and looked exactly like a giant-sized man, but was completely covered in 4-inch long, shiny, dark brown hair, with the exception of what appeared to be a weathered grey face, which looked exceedingly human, with a beard and a moustache, a very flat, wide nose, and deep-set dark eyes. The critter had overlong arms that I believe could potentially have touched his toes without him needing to bend over, and he had the hugest hands and feet that I've ever seen. I would certainly not describe him as fat. Bulky and burly, yes. Fat, no. He was exceedingly muscular and dense, towering at 9 foot tall, and easily over 800 pounds, and about 3 foot wide across the shoulder area, and the size of those humongous shoulders was quite literally mind-blowing. They were literally titanic. If my husband had not been in my presence, I personally believe I would have fainted with the shock of seeing this thing, as he was so imposing and intimidating. We watched as the critter glided towards the trapdoor in the ground, and when he arrived at the layers of moss that concealed the door, he thrust them aside with a vigorous sweeping motion with his hefty hand. For a moment he paused and stood very still, while his flat aquatic nose appeared to twitch. Then he bent down and lifted up a piece of moss to his nose and sniffed it, and a look of bewilderment came over his face. And then I discerned that he had definitely smelt us. He lifted up another piece of moss to his face once again, sniffing it carefully, almost as if he was reaffirming to himself what he'd actually smelt. For a second he looked befuddled, and almost appeared to dislike the smell, as he wrinkled his nose with a disgust look, as though he was smelling something vile. I was to learn later that many people of colour think that white people smell exactly like wet dog. If that is what we smell like to him, only 1,000 times worse, given that I established he has a remarkable sense of smell, we must smell pretty bad. I watched him examining the ground, as though looking for footprints, and that was when my level of anxiety escalated. Please God, I prayed, don't let him see us. The critter glanced around the forest, with eyes that almost seemed to scan the area with an X-ray vision. I stood incredibly still. I do not recall a time in my life when I was more petrified, and there are no words that can do any justice to the level of terror that I experienced. Indeed, it was so profound, I doubt that if the critter had spotted me, I would have even been capable of running away. Of that I am most sure. I could see the critter's gaze directed towards the trees, where we were hiding, with a pinpoint accuracy, and his eyes remained fixed on our hiding spot. My heart began pounding violently in my chest, and my hands were sweating profusely. The critter turned around, put a little stone near the door, and then replaced the moss over the outside of it, while slipping inside and closing it behind him. I've never felt so relieved in all my life. But my husband and I continued to wait for a while, and then we made our way back home, without saying a single word. Finally I said to my husband, "What in God's name was that?" "I have no idea," said my husband. "But whatever it is, it's as real as you and I.
and I think I can finally establish what happened with your great-uncle all those years ago. I believe the man stumbled down a dark passage, brushing against cobwebs, while seeing rats scampering past him, a seemingly ominous prelude for what was to come. We know he smelt something awful, which he would mentally have associated with a hellish domain. He entered a large room, and all he could see were these dark, shadowy figures, which possibly fit the description of what we have just seen ourselves. I imagine he encountered a family of these beings, which he mistook for demons. Easy to do, for the red eyes were possibly red eye shine, which occurs with nocturnal animals, and in the dark those creatures would be very frightening. Perhaps they were stoking up a fire on a cold night. I can only conclude your uncle's mind exaggerated what he was discerning. One of the creatures screamed at him and began to follow him down the passage, breathing heavily, causing your uncle to conclude that he was being pursued by a demon.
Oh my goodness, Roy, you're absolutely right. You've got it in a nutshell. That's exactly what happened. And so it was we established that there were a few of these outlandish creatures living under our home in an air raid shelter that my great-uncle's father had built during the Second World War. Roy and I naturally never told Aunt May what we'd uncovered, nor did we tell her about our peculiar experience with a humanoid creature that I established many years later to be a Bigfoot. I'm glad to tell you that Great-Aunt May lived a full life, and one night in 1993, when she was 94 years old, she slipped away peacefully in her sleep, fulfilling her wishes of breathing her last breath in her own home. It was an honour living with such a wizened soul, whose vast wealth of knowledge and discernment enriched our lives and taught us much. In the years that followed, my husband and I raised 4 young children who have long since left home. But growing up, there were random, fleeting sightings of Bigfoot activity on our land, and even today I discern soft moss over the trapdoor that leads me to believe that generations of Bigfoot have lived in that underground air raid shelter. There have been times on icy winter days that smoke has been seen rising from the ground, which I know is Bigfoot having a fire in the underground shelter, and it has always made me smile, as I believe the creatures want to live in peace and mean us no harm. My youngest daughter Raven had an experience once where she was playing out in the woods and describes a very tall, hairy creature watching her from behind a tree. She is my only daughter who appears to be more sensitive to otherworldly phenomena. Raven was fearless on seeing the creature and waved at it, and she said it waved back to her, moved away from the tree, and watched her as she returned to the house. She said to me, "Mummy, it was so beautiful." I asked her why it was beautiful. "Its eyes," she explained. "They were so kind." When Raven was 3 years old, she always asked us who the nice old lady in our house was, who wore her white hair in a bun, and visited our house from time to time. All these years later, I've pondered whether she was seeing Aunt May. So there you are. That's my story.
What an absolutely fabulous story, and thank you so much for sharing. I can't imagine how easy it is to be under the ground in a tunnel and it's very dark, and to mistake a Bigfoot for a demon. That would be very easy to do. Until next time, goodbye and good night.